Hello everyone. For this section, I will be covering task E from the ACS, which focuses on teaching, effective teaching in a professional environment. And I'll focus on how I would apply that in real training. Alright, then let's get started. One idea that really stood out to me is that teaching is not just delivery, it's influence. Okay. Students don't remember everything I say, but they remember how they performed and whether they trusted in the instructor. So, as an instructor, my role is not just to explain a maneuver or help them pass a check ride. My role is to shape how they think, how they perform, and how they make decisions in the aircraft. Because at the end of the day, we are not just teaching skills, we're developing a pilot. Because we're an instructor, not a textbook. Okay. And this slide outlines the ACS objectives. So what stands out to me is this is not just about understanding concepts. It's about demonstrating professional behavior and applying techniques to guide the students. So the focus is not knowledge alone. It's how that knowledge is used during real instruction. And that's what makes this task practical, not theoretical. Okay. All right. So responsibilities, okay. And this slide defines the role of the instructor. And one phrase here that stands out is the instructor must transfer understanding, not just information, while always keeping safety first and helping develop the student as a pilot. To me, that means the role of the instructor is much bigger than just teaching a skill. So, for example, if a student is preparing for a solo cross country, I'm not only checking whether they can maintain heading, altitude, or airspeed. I also need to evaluate whether they can make safe decisions about weather, fuel, routing, alternates, and overall risk. In other words, I'm not just teaching the airplane, I'm helping build judgment. That's why I think the instructor's role includes three things at the same time. So, teaching knowledge, developing skill, and shaping decision making. And out of all of that, safety, of course, remains the center. If I ever teach in a way that produces performance without judgment, that would be incomplete instruction. So, this slide reminds me that my job is not just to prepare the student for a maneuver or test. My job is to help develop someone who can think and operate safely as a pilot. Yes. So this slide focuses on motivation using PIEs. Actually, since I already covered this in my previous FY video, and I briefly go over it here and focus on how I would apply in real training. So, for example, instead of just teaching weather as information, I would turn it into the decision-based scenario, something like you're trying to get home and the weather is getting worse. What would you do? And now the student is not just listening, they are actively thinking and making decisions. And that changes the entire learning experience. It becomes more engaging, more realistic, and much more memorable, right? So to me, motivation doesn't just come from the content, it comes from how relevant the lesson feels to the student. Okay, and this slide emphasizes positive instruction. So, for example, if a student makes a poor decision during a diversion, I wouldn't just say that was wrong. I would first acknowledge what they did right, like you recognize the need to divert. That's good. Then guide them, let's talk about how we can choose a better airport. So I'm still correcting the mistake, and but I'm also protecting their confidence, right? Because confidence is what allows the student to keep improving And I think positive instruction is extremely important in training. As an instructor, I would consistently reinforce what the student did well while still guiding them toward improvement. I would also connect the lesson back to their original goal and keep motivating them throughout the training process. From my own experience as a student, that kind of instruction made a big difference actually. It helped me stay engaged, improve faster, and build confidence over time. So I believe positive instruction doesn't just improve performance, it shapes how the student approaches learning overall. And this slide is about minimizing frustration, which is a key part of effective instruction. So students don't just struggle because something is difficult. They often struggle because they feel overwhelmed or unsure of what to focus on, right? For example, if a student is working on landings and I start correcting like airspeed, flare timing, centerline, pitch, and power all at once, they won't know what the priority is. And when that happens, their performance usually gets worse, not better. So instead, I would narrow the focus. I would clearly tell them something like, for this landing, I want you to focus mainly on maintaining stable approach speed. And now the student knows exactly what matters. Then, once that improves, I can gradually add the next element. This approach reduces frustration and makes the learning process more manageable. And this connects directly to MACKBAG. So, as an instructor, I would motivate students. So, motivate a student by connecting the lesson to their goals, approach them as an individual, not a standard template, and give constructive criticism instead of negative feedback, and keep them informed so there are no surprises, and stay consistent in my expectations and be honest about mistakes while giving credit when it's due. So overall, minimizing frustration is not just about being patient. It's about structuring the lesson in a way that the student can succeed step by step. And this slide talks about adapting to each student. For example, one student might be strong technically, but weak in decision making, and another might be very cautious but struggle with aircraft control. So, at this time, I wouldn't teach them the same way. I would just pacing, explanation style, lesson focus. But one thing does not change is the standard. So the standard stays the same, but the path to reach it changes depending on the student. Okay, cool. Additional instructor responsibilities. Okay, so yeah, and this slide covers the additional instructor responsibilities, often summarized as PEEP PASS. And these are not optional. They are required responsibilities as a CFI. So beyond just teaching maneuvers, this defines my legal, ethical, and professional role in training. So for example, pilot supervision means I'm always responsible for the safety of the flight, especially when the student is not yet fully independent. Even if the student is flying, I'm still evaluating the situation and ready to step in if needed. Evaluation of student piloting ability is also continuous. I'm not just evaluating at the end of the lesson, I'm constantly asking myself, like, can this student perform this safely and consistently? That directly connects to whether they are ready for solo or advancement. And endorsements are another critical part. When I sign an endorsement, I'm not just verifying that they've completed a requirement only. I'm certifying that they are safe to operate in that specific situation. So that decision carries real responsibility, and and a practical test recommendation is similar. So before recommending a student for a check ride, I need to confirm that they meet all requirements and can perform consistently, not just occasionally, right? And pilot proficiency also applies to me as the instructor. If I'm not current or proficient, that directly impacts the safety and quality of training. So I have a responsibility to stay sharp in both skill and knowledge. Additional training and endorsements come up frequently as well, such as high performance or complex or flight reviews. So in those cases, I need to make sure that the student truly understands and can safely apply what they've learned. And finally, responsibilities like see and avoid. So, in monitoring the student's decision-making process before solo, remind me that safety is always the foundation of everything we do, right? So overall, PEEP PASS. PEEP PASS shows that being a CFI is not just about teaching, it's about continuously managing risk, evaluating readiness, and ensuring that every student we train is safe to operate in the real world. Okay. And this slide for the endorsements. Yeah. When it comes to endorsements, CFI must be competent in both understanding and proper applying Advisory Circular 6165 Juliet. Endorsements are not just administrative tasks. They are legal authorizations that allow a student or applicant to move to the next stage of training or testing. That means every endorsement carries responsibility. And the endorsements I've organized here follow a logical progression based on the private pilot training flow. And you can use this sequence as a reference to understand how each endorsements build on the previous one. And yeah, so starting with the knowledge test phase here, I would issue A32. In most cases, when preparing a student for the private pilot knowledge test, I would use A32. A32 is the endorsement that certifies the applicant that has received the required aeronautical knowledge training under 61105 and is prepared to take the FAA knowledge test. Since most students take the FAA written exam through an approved testing center, this is the endorsement I typically use. But, however, there's an important distinction when a student completes their training through a home study curriculum instead of traditional ground school or instructor-led program. In that case, Alpha 82 may be used to certify that the applicant has demonstrated satisfactory knowledge of the required aeronautical subjects. Okay, and then after the knowledge test is completed, the next step is preparing for the practical test. So at this stage, I would use a Alpha 2 and Alpha 1. Well, Alpha 1 confirms that the applicant meets the prerequisites for the practical test under 6139, including required training and recent preparation. And Alpha 2 is used to review any deficiencies identified on the knowledge test. So ensuring the applicant has received additional training in those weak areas before proceeding. And once those requirements are met and the applicant is fully prepared, I would use Alpha 33. This is the practical test endorsement, which certifies that the applicant has received the required training under 61107 and 61109 and is ready for the check ride. And then if the applicant does not pass the check ride, then Alpha 73 is required. This endorsement confirms that the applicant has received additional training in the deficient areas and is prepared to retake the test under 61.49. And each of these endorsements serves a very specific purpose, and they must be given in the correct sequence. As a CFI, it's not enough to memorize endorsement numbers, and you need to understand when each one applies. and what regulation it's tied to, and what responsibility you're accepting when you sign it. Okay. Great. Solo endorsements flow. So now I'd like to go over the solo endorsements. Using this flow that I organized has bacon over pizza during the cross country, so BCN over pizza cross country, to help keep everything structured and easy to remember. So starting with the pre-solo phase. First, we have Alpha 3. Alpha 3 under 6187 Bravo. This is the pre-solo aeronautical knowledge endorsements. So before a student is allowed to solo, they must complete a written test covering the applicable regulations, airspace, procedures, and limitations. So as the instructor, I must review that test and ensure the student has a full understanding of those topics. And next is Alpha 4. Alpha 4 under 6187 Charlie. And this is the pre-solo flight training endorsements. And this confirms that the student has demonstrated proficiency in the required maneuvers and procedures, such as takeoffs, landings, emergency procedures, and overall aircraft control. And at this point, I'm verifying that the students can safely operate the aircraft by themselves. So once both knowledge and flight proficiency are confirmed, we move to the first solo endorsement. And this is Alpha 6 under 6187 November. And this allows the student to conduct solo flights within a first 90-day period. This is the standard initial solo endorsement, and it must be renewed every 90 days if the student continues solo operations. So now, and now for night operations, there's a separate endorsement, and that's Alpha 5 under 6187 Oscar. This is specifically for night solo flight. It does not replace the daytime solo endorsement, but rather adds the privilege to fly solo at night. And the student must receive specific night training, and this endorsement limits them to night operations only under the conditions specified. So, yeah. And if the student continues training beyond the initial 90 days, I've then issued Alpha 7 under 6187 Papa. This is simply a renewal of solo privileges for an additional 90 days period, confirming that the student is still competent and safe to operate solo. Okay, so after the local solo phase, we move into solo cross-country operations. So first is Alpha 9 under 6197 Charlie 1 and 2. And this endorsement confirms that the student has received the required cross-country training outlined in 6193 Echo. This includes navigation, flight planning, weather evaluation, and risk management. So it essentially prepares the student for independent cross-country operations. And finally, for each individual solo cross-country flight, we use Alpha 10, it's under 6193 Charlie 3. This is a flight-specific endorsement, meaning I must review and approve each planned cross-country flight, including the route, weather, the performance considerations. And this ensures that every solo cross-country is conducted safely and within the student's capability. The key point with solo endorsements is that they are progressive and conditional. So each endorsement builds on the previous one. Okay, cool. And this slide is a simple chart I put together to help identify what I need to evaluate to ensure my student is ready for a successful check ride. One interesting pattern I noticed is that, except for instruments, the regulation references tend to follow the structure. So eligibility requirements often end in 3, right? And aeronautical knowledge in 5. And flight proficiency in 7, right? And the aeronautical experience in 9. So this is just something I personally use as a reference to stay organized. Within the chart, you can see, excuse me, and what tasks need to be covered and what the students need to be prepared further before being recommended for the practical test. Okay, cool. And this slide focuses on additional training and endorsements. So this is important because training doesn't stop after certificate or rating. And as a CFI, I'm also responsible for additional qualifications that pilots need throughout their flying career. For example, flight reviews, high performance endorsements, complex aircraft, wheel plane, tailwheel, and high altitude operations. So these are all situations where a pilot needs further training before acting as PIC. So in these cases, my role is not just to check a box or complete requirements. I need to make sure the pilot truly understands the aircraft or operation, can apply the knowledge safely, and can perform consistently in real-world conditions. And this slide reminds us that instructors must stay proficient. And also, if I'm not sharp, that directly affects the student. So, yeah, I would also continuously maintain my own proficiency, not just for myself, but all for the safety of my students too, right? Okay. All right, so so this slide focuses on professionalism, often summarized as SADPA. As an instructor, professionalism is not just about appearance. It directly affects how the student learns and performs. For example, if the instructor stays calm during an abnormal or high workload situation, the student will likely remain calm as well. But if the instructor becomes frustrated or reactive, the student immediately picks up on that too, which can increase stress and reduce performance. So professionalism directly shapes the learning environment. So looking at SADPA, sincerity means genuinely caring about the student's progress. So students can tell if you're just going through the motions. Acceptance means meeting the student where they are without judgment or even when they struggle. And demeanor is especially important in the cockpit, so staying calm, composed, and in control at all times. And proper language means using clear standard aviation communication, which reduces confusion and builds good habits. And appearance reflects the standards of the profession. So you represent aviation as an instructor. So overall, professionalism is not just about how you how do you look or act, and it directly influences student confidence, communication, and overall training effectiveness. So, and ultimately, a professional instructor creates an environment where the student can learn safely, effectively, and consistently. Cool. And this slide emphasizes being a role model. So, as an instructor, students don't just listen, they watch everything I do. For example, before making a turn, if I consistently clear the area, check for traffic, and I say clear left, the student starts to see that as the standard and naturally does the same. So what I constantly do becomes the student's habit. And that's why being a role model is not optional. It's constant part of instruction. Okay. Cool. Evaluation. Well, yes. So, yeah, this slide is about evaluation. For example, during a simulated engine failure, I wouldn't just look at whether the checklist was completed. I would also look at how quickly they recognized the problem and what kind of landing area they selected and how they managed the situation. So that gives a much more accurate evaluation than just saying that was good or that needs work, right? Cool. So should be observable performance, standard based, and effective. And this slide focuses on how the instructor should behave during evaluation. And during evaluation, my role is not just to observe, it's to guide learning while maintaining safety. For example, during a simulated engine failure, a student might not pick the best landing spot, right? So, but it's still safe option. In that case, I would let them continue. So they have the opportunity to think through the situation. Then during the debrief, I would explain what could have been improved and why. But if the student begins to turn too low or heads toward an unsafe area, that's when I would step in immediately. So the key is knowing when to let the student learn and when to intervene for safety. At the same time, I would keep the student informed of my expectations and correct errors in a clear and constructive way. And the goal is not just to evaluate performance, but to help the student develop the ability to recognize and correct their own mistakes. Okay, so this slide focuses on continuous improvement. So not only the student, but I also need to continuously improve as an instructor. For example, if I notice that student keeps struggling with the same lesson I teach, I wouldn't assume it's always the student. I would also look at my own instruction and ask what I can do differently. And to support that, I would stay current by attending seminars, reviewing for aim, and continuing to develop my knowledge and skills, and also I can earn additional ratings too. Alright, so to summarize, we looked at the instructor's responsibilities, including both teaching and the additional responsibilities defined in PEEP PASS. We also covered how to create an effective learning environment by motivating students, minimizing frustration, and using positive instruction. Then we talked about professionalism, including SADPA, and the importance of being role model. And finally, we went over evaluation, how to assess students objectively, and while allowing them to learn and maintaining safety throughout the process. All right, cool. Well, now that's it for this section. We covered the task E, echo from the FOI. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.